I guess my first question about the work in the show and the research that kind of surrounds it is about how you're defining Black secret technologies and how you're thinking about the relationship to technologies of labor and reproduction, or reproduction and production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so just for complete transparency, Black secret technology is not my own phrase. It's from an album that was made in 1995 by a guy called Gerald by the same name, Black Secret Technology. And when I first heard that album in my old professor's studio, I was just like kind of in love with the music, but also just like trying to understand for myself, like, what is Black secret technology? What does it look like? For me, it was Black inventions. So it was inventions made by Black engineers, Black amateur engineers and inventors. So I would just source patents or drawings of patents by Black inventors. And there wasn't really any like kind of theme or instructions or rules that I was following. I was just like Googling, really using Google's patents, which is maybe another kind of conversation to have of like where those were being sourced from, but just trying to get imagery so then I could translate those patents into drawings of my own. So it transformed and morphed though, right? Like this idea of like what Black secret technology could be. For me, it still stands into something that is, I don't know, it's something that's like, on the one hand, fueled by or energized by some type of necessity or lack that is present, so that a tool or a device or technology can be implemented. And the operator or the inventor is like a stand-in or a representative of how it becomes like a Black secret technology, but also like what those technologies are. So sometimes when I was looking for these patents, I would like pause on an invention of like something like a hot comb. You know, someone like needed, you know, this tool to exist at this particular time for what reasons to, basically exist and live in that particular time. You know, the straightening of hair was like a necessity, but for what reasons? You know? Where I landed with those drawings of patents was with Norbert Rilleaux, who was the son of a white chemical engineer and a Black mother that we don't have a lot of information on. But we do know that Norbert Rilleaux was a Black man in the South, American South, able to walk in the streets through a really complex set of systems that were like helping him do that, right? So his father, being wealthy, a wealthy chemical engineer, allowed him to go to the best schools. He actually goes to school in Paris to study mechanics and engineering, and then comes back with a new technology, a new tool to make a system more efficient, which is the Jamaica train system, the process or the production of taking sugarcane juice and crystallizing it through the use of enslaved people ladling boiling hot sugar cane juice from one kettle to the next. So his invention, the multiple effect evaporator system, which he designs in Paris and brings back to Louisiana, is installed in plantations across the South to make this production of sugar more efficient. This kind of labor is like, you know, meant to be seen as like, I think, a form of relief, at least when I've read about it. It seems like some people talk about this invention as a form of relief for the enslaved people, or somehow a way to, remove that kind of labor from them. But I think it's a little bit deeper than that. He's in some ways it could be read that he's a capitalist, because he does make profit off the system. He designs it, he installs it, but at the same time, because of the burden of his representation of his identity, I think his narrative gets a little bit diluted in the sense that he is really closely tied to, developing a machine that can be seen as a form of liberation, an invention to liberate, the burden of this type of work, this violent work. There's, boiling hot cane juice from a kettle. There's injury, there's spillage, there's burns. So there's that on the one hand, but on the other is that Rilleaux saw a problem and he provided a solution for profit. But that's not, it's just that's not all who he is, but it's something that I'm trying to think about through the work and through the research. It's just how do you make work around that?
It's interesting when you talk about his biography because it is so complicated, and I think, also that he's in Louisiana where they had this very complicated and complex kind of hierarchy of mulatto, these different kind of categories or hierarchies of how black you were versus how close you are to whiteness, which I think really complicates his relationship to, or rather his position to, black people who are enslaved on the plantation. You know what I mean? And then this invention always kind of makes me think about something like the cotton gin that kind of transformed cotton production and really relieved certain kinds of the intensity of labor in that context, but transformed cotton and made it into one of the biggest cash crops in the United States.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about that kind of tension between where it kind of transforms and liberates certain aspects of labor and where it kind of reignites some or doubles down on that system.
Yeah.
That's kind of going off topic, but
no, but it is interesting, and it also makes me think about agriculture, production, invention, technologies in general, and how they have influenced or impacted human life is not divorced from the cotton gin or this, multiple effect evaporator system, but, also in terms of pesticides and who has to use those pesticides or who gets sprayed on by those pesticides.
Yeah,
and that's
in direct contact with
yeah.
them. Yeah.
So who's in direct contact with these technologies, whether it's physically by the sense of who's operating that system, who's operating the cotton gin, and who's operating these multiple effect evaporator systems. Going back to his narrative and what is also on the periphery of his narrative is how or the reception of his invention initially when it comes to the South is, with resistance by, from plantation owners, right? Because it's a fear around well, if we teach those who are enslaved how to use or operate these systems, then they're smarter than me, or then they'll rebel or something like this. So without, maybe this is a reach, but without, thinking about it in this way, his invention, even threatens the fear of some kind of resistance or rebellion, even though it's still removing that laborer who would rebel if they did learn that technology or that tool. I think there's like a misstep too with that, that kind of, that fear, that's through like a relation of resistance or refusal to work, or becoming like in power, through this the operation or the knowledge that sits around that possibility of being able to acquire some type of new, this kind of new understanding or grasping of like how to be in the space of like agricultural production,
Also kind of negates the ways in which enslaved people brought technologies that enabled, agriculture to prosper in the United States, that enabled like sugar production, and indigo is one in particular that had a heart that was very difficult to get going as a cash crop until black people from the West Indies actually were brought here and, brought their knowledge. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but there's actually like speculation that the cotton gin was not invented by, I forget who it is officially the inventor of the cotton gin, that it was actually invented by a black person.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll find.
Yeah, please find that for me.
So maybe we can talk about more about the process of you working with the patents, of creating the drawings, and how that relates, or how you're thinking about reproduction and also iteration in this work, because there are multiple iterations of the pieces and you're kind of returning to them, which I think is like a really interesting aspect to consider.
Yeah. So with the patent, I was working in the multiple, like producing, outputting multiple drawings, and I also tried different methods, like using a laser cutter as a way to make an image or make a drawing as well. But initially, it was this idea of like, not being aware to an archive, right? Not being aware of important engineers, important inventors that were black, So I thought about that, like, why was it that I didn't know these people by name? Why didn't I? Why wasn't I familiar already? And that kind of made me want to start my own archive, or develop my own archive that I didn't see to exist yet. And I think that was the main drive, with producing in multiple. So finding the patent, and then what I kind of see as like transcribing the drawing of the invention, the drawing of the patent, because it was a projection onto newsprint, and I just traced over it. And the act of tracing, or trying to, transcribe or translate these patents, I wanted to think about myself in this other position, that's removed from the invention, removed from the idea, but not too far away. Because these patents that we look at, I don't believe that they're always necessarily the hand of the inventor. There's like an artist who is either in front of the invention, or has some sketches, or has like some access to the idea, but then is the artist who translates the idea into an image. And I sit in this other position next to that, by this other tracing, so this other kind of remembering, but also just like still thinking about like, like how to make an archive. And then the other question was about Redox Strip, that
Iterations, but I was also
iteration.
thinking about just thinking about like the act of like tracing. For some reason, it just makes me think about, or the word like conjuring kind of comes to mind, of like kind of, you know, trying to, conjuring. I don't know what else to say about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's this. Yeah, conjuring is an interesting word. The word I associated with it was like alchemy too. Yeah, like an alchemical process, like, you know. And the more cheesier, cornier way of thinking about it, it's like someone like putting some potion together and like a spirit comes out or something. But tracing for me is, I started using that word, I think after I did the drawings, and because the act, you know, the act of a trace is like behind something or behind someone. It's like it's a step back or behind, maybe it's a step behind something. There's like something in front of it, right? Because usually there's a projection, there's like something thrown onto the surface that then you transcribe or you follow. And I just liked, you know, like thinking about it in this way, you know, at least as, I know that sometimes tracing and this, you know, kind of conjures another type of presence, right? You know, it's like a second presence, or it's a presence that's available and not available, because it's, I mean, I see it as like mine and not mine, and, you know, these drawings. Redox Strip has like followed several different types of iterations. It's a piece from 2019, and the first time I installed it, I had, you know, a DJ Screw album that was kind of embedded in this soundproofing material. I had another speaker facing the speaker that is currently facing the wall in the space in this gallery, but instead it was two speakers facing each other. There was a tape player that was playing some sound that was, you know, a range from a reading of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, to interviews with DJ Screw, to music by DJ Screw, to music by a guy called Gerald. So it was just like really a playlist that I was kind of making while I was making the object itself. So there's a YouTube playlist called Redox Strip playlist that's available for the public, and that's kind of like somewhat research, somewhat just songs that I like to think about alongside the work itself. But yeah, there was like some other tools alongside this work that are not present and not available. An iPad was there as well, that was playing a video of this like black man who's at a tech convention, some type of tech convention, and he is putting his hand in front of a soap dispenser, and it's not giving him soap, but then he's asking his like white colleague to do it, the same thing, and the soap dispenser gives it to him, and then he puts his hand back in front of the black, you know, man puts his hand back in front of the soap dispenser and doesn't get anything. You know, it was just like a lot of information initially with the work itself, but I was seeing some type of threads between, you know, what was being heard and what was being seen. Like, you know, Fanon in that section of the reading of the book is talking about, you know, being detected and not being detected, and the video was also, I think, showing that, so that's why it was available. But, you know, with this show and this installation, I wanted to strip some of that information away from the work and try to contextualize it with Ryu and contextualize it with, you know, what's happening in this space and in this show, which has to do with, latent heat and like some kind of hiddenness and also, visibility, like, kind of sitting in these like straddling, more like a straddling kind of position. And yeah, and I think this iteration of Redux Strip, I think in comparison to its previous installs, takes a step back and doesn't take so much space. It sits in a corner, which I like. That was kind of how I saw it when I first came into this space. It was like being kind of tucked away into that space. Yeah, but the thing that is still present from 2019 is the glassware. That's a series of distillation condensers and the same Sprite and NyQuil concoction that's been like heated up and liquefied over the last couple of years.
There's like so much I want to say now, because I just had, like, as you were talking and talking about tracings, it has almost like a second time, or this kind of reintroduction of the past into a present. So kind of like this kind of temporal layering, you know what I mean? And then tracings kind of also acting as a kind of concealment that pulls something into the present.
Yeah.
And then, this is like, it's not even a question, it's just a series of thoughts. DJ Screw, and the ways in which he kind of uses these different processes of overlaying, of slowing down, of literally chopping and screwing the song, and how that in and of itself is like another kind of like, or how like this kind of remix is a kind of like tracing or return to.
Thinking about DJ Screw's practice, and, as like being in a kind of situated space with time, and not just through like how we hear his music, but then also when you hear him like talk about what he was doing early on. It was like a video of him being interviewed by like the local news, in the 90s, and he's just like talking about wanting to slow things down, like not just like music, but also life, like just also wanting to be on a different, timeline or a different, different time scale,
Different timeline. That's so,
yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, but that's what I heard, a lot of, even with going back to Redux Strip, like, the reason why I have the speaker facing the wall is because, this is how I saw his speakers and the images of him, like in his living room, so there's so much, in this, way that he was working, and also the way that I'm trying to carry over maybe or return to those particular practices or methods that he was trying to offer the public through his production, through his producing, that I'm trying to get at through an extra, maybe a different kind of looking at his work, not just through song, but also through like how his space looked.
But also kind of in like the processes, like that you have this kind of return to materials, but then there's also this kind of, I guess similarly, a way in which you're working and also asking of the viewer to kind of slow down in their engagement, and also in the way that you're kind of thinking about each iteration and picking it apart and reconstructing it to kind of hone in on certain aspects.
Yeah.
It feels like, I feel like that's one of the things that always that I find so fascinating about like the simple aspect of DJ Screw and slowing a song down, and how you hear all of these things that are super important, but then get kind of erased by the speed and like but when you slow them down, they kind of take on probably to a certain extent their original meaning, their original significance in the structure of the song. And how that kind of opens up so many different things, or shifting the timeline.
Yeah, literally he's shifting timelines by slowing the music down, but also just like that desire to shift one's own like actual timeline. Is something that I'm wanting someone in the space to choose to do, right? I can see someone being in this space and looking very quickly. That's fine. But also, I think there's enough space in some of the works to allow room for a kind of slowness, which DJ Screw does a lot, right?
Yeah.
He's like sampling a lot of different types of music, but also like how that can show up, in the round, or like in the sculpture form too, right? Just going back to the choice of materials in the work, and I guess it's a way of working for me is to be into what I'm into at that moment, whether it's through music, whether it's through listening to talks, whether it's through reading or watching or whatever it is, and then trying to piece those things together. And sometimes the material is like very contingent on the source of its origin, like having a DJ Screw album present in the work, or having the aesthetics or the look or the feel of like science with a capital S by having chemical glassware as a way to talk about how do you parse out what these different systems of knowledges together, right? How do we sit them together? DJ Screws has and did create a kind of knowledge. It was something that wasn't being heard. We weren't listening to music in this way, and now I feel like every other song I hear on, Spotify. Not every other song, but I have.
He always comes back in some way.
His hand comes back into like our contemporary.
So my last question is about how you might be thinking about or view within your work or within the research that you're doing, kind of tension between liberation and latency, and perhaps how you're thinking about that in relationship to Black secret technologies.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I know, like, that's so funny. Yeah, I guess like the way to answer this question for myself is to kind of walk through, those two terms for my own way to think about this, which is, latent, this like word latent, and liberation, and what they can mean and what they do mean. And so I guess how I was drawn to this idea of latent heat, and basically thinking about forms or forms of like steam, or forms of things that are not completely visible, that can drive or provide a force. And one way of working sometimes for myself is looking closely at a word or a term or a sentence or a phrase. So when I saw that, reuse observation of latent heat as a way to drive this system, it made me want to look closer at what was latent, what does that mean, and on a etymological level, you can see that it's also a way of saying, to lie hidden, or to lie, or in a hidden form of some sort. And sometimes latent heat is described as energy in hidden form. So that's also where that comes from in the title around the work. Because I do see, a part of Rilleaux's narrative is a kind of energy that it straddles a kind of hiddenness. It's the only word I have right now, is like this position that sits in between, two places and two spaces. Going back to, how labor shows up in the work, we could also, think through how the labor of those who would have been doing the Jamaica train or the sugar train process, those who are, those like people who were enslaved, that labor is often hidden too, in these particular situations or dynamics with his invention. Going back to like who is operating that machine, that technology, was another way of like how to think through these laser cuts that are in the space. We have like the chemical compound of codeine, and next to a drawing of Norbert Rilleaux's multiple effect evaporator. It's like a section of the drawing, so it's like more of a zoomed in image of a part of his system. And then next to that is an image that I found online when I was trying to search for people harvesting sugar cane. It's an image that if I had more time to look into, or if I took more time to look into, I could find a name, an artist, but I searched that image several ways. I did like 10i, where you do an image to use the image to do a search, and I also just searched for like whatever title it had on stock websites. But I'm still kind of unaware of like who actually is the artist and the origin of the painting. And then the last image is again Norbert Rilleaux's multiple effect evaporator system. That's from a different angle. To just go back to these images for a second, and like this idea of latent and like hiddenness, like there's something in the act of like etching into the surface that's already black. This is photo mounting board. Sometimes this is called museum board, but I experimented with it around the same time that I was making redox strip in 2019 with that material. And I think working with images this way developed another meaning because of the results you get for black, etching into a black surface. You get more visible, like black images. The material of the board is just like black all the way through. So as a way of making, I liked the idea of, doubling down into the material and doubling down into how it's translating to an audience, and also just like, it does this thing of straddling with how it's seen. If you're too far away, they're just black squares on the wall. But the closer you get to just read them as an image. And this type of looking or seeing in the space happens in other works, like the work on this back wall, which is like a portrait of Norbert Rilleaux with the the formula for latent heat kind of drawn on top of on top of his portrait. But it's using there's a privacy screen in front of that image. And so when you're, just off alignment of the privacy screen, you get like a completely black square. But if you kind of move around that work, his image becomes visible again. And that, again, just like trying to work through material and think through materials. The privacy filter is something that I just carried around and noticed on someone's phone one day, and was just like, oh wow, that's, it like said something about me looking at someone else's phone, but also it was like kind of interesting that, that it does this like kind of thing with where you are placed. Like you have to be in a very specific position to see or be visible, or to see what someone's looking at, or what you're looking at. It's other question of liberation, and I think it's something that keeps coming up for me, and I'm still struggling to answer it, like what does this work have to do with Black liberation or liberation in general? And the only way I've been able to answer it is that I'm still kind of unsure if this invention can or does provide some type of liberation to those who were formerly put to work, in the case of sugar production, put to a kind of work that was not thinking in relation to like how it would harm their bodies, right? There was no care of like how the sugar, the crystallized sugar was made, with the Jamaica train or the kettle, the sugar train with the boiling hot kettles. It was just like a system that was designed to get the product, regardless if anybody was harmed in the process. And I'm not too sure if Rilleaux's invention, or this idea of how latent heat works, does anything differently. Because it is a tool, or it's an invention, with a kind of capitalist agenda, which is thinking for profit and efficiency. So production over, it's like quantity over bodies, it's like accuracy over bodies, I think is why that is designed. How to be precise. I don't know. I don't know if it lends itself to any form of liberation or liberating, methods. But I don't know. I guess it's like also how you look at it. I was like trying to read, Catherine McKendrick's new book, Dear Science. After I got like some of your questions, and seeing how she talks about liberation in the introduction and in kind of the first chapter, as through a lot of different ways, but one way is through citation and like naming, very specific authors. And I wonder like if it could be read that way, that, and I don't know if I would agree with it, but is it an act of liberation if I'm thinking through how McKittrick is thinking about liberation as through citation and through kind of a naming, even though they are talking about Black feminist scholars,
Or through like kind of what we were talking about, through this kind of conjuring, like the tracing, through the kind of returning to the material. One of the things that I wrote, I guess in line with this, is I was thinking about how like science, of like the scientific inventions of like the 20th century and 19th century kind of transform, maybe more so 20th century, kind of like transform the way that people saw the world, because they revealed things that otherwise were entirely invisible. Yeah. It's like the point when people start realizing that there are like there's bacteria, like there's things around us that we can't see at all. And so like the question that kind of brought me to was, and I think that if in thinking about all of the work that you're doing and the way that you're kind of moving through your practice, it seems like there's kind of this question of like what gets liberated by the experiment or by this kind of by this kind of scientific pursuit. And I mean, that seems, that becomes more complex when you consider all of these Black inventors that, essentially are buried by time and by like the kind of structures of anti-Blackness that essentially want to remove them from like the history of science. But there are still these, these attempts. And so what happens, what are these kind of, how do they articulate these different forms or instances of liberation? And that seems to me, if I'm going to project onto your work, that seems to me a part of like the question, a part of the kind of maybe thread.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good, it's a really nice observation. And also it brings me to a couple things, and one being like, if I'm thinking about experimentation as an act of a kind of liberation, and also if we're thinking about liberation as an act of something to be conjured that, is not from one source, but it takes on, multiple, modes of making, or multiple modes of looking and listening, then I would say that it does involve a kind of poetics of that science. And when I say poetics, I guess I'm thinking of something that is that can't contain its existence or being through one discipline or one origin or one source, that it needs to be able to live within the spaces across multiples of feelings, of also of feeling, but also of sitting with how we can't live without the burden of scientific observations that don't lend itself in the light of human life, but instead it's dependent on accuracy and precision and objectivity. But then in that kind of observable like methodologies of objectivity, it goes into question of who and what ends up being those objects of study, right? So so through these kind of demonstrations or experimentations that happen in the work, something else is conjured, right? There's another reading that for me, it's like there's another potential of an alternative reading, outside of what the demonstration is providing, right? When I saw the black fire snake experiment on YouTube, I didn't think about just like how through the process of burning sugar, you get, this other cool looking form, but also just thinking about how it can reread this organization of ingredients or things or elements that goes from, completely white to completely black. This translation or transformation or transmutation of contents that go from yeah, visibility to invisibility, you know, and you can't do that with every observation. You can't do that with every demonstration of like chemical reactions. But the ones that you can do, it makes me pause and try to stay with it, and conjure another meaning out of it, right? Or try to see another meaning inside of it. And I think that's, for me, that's a kind of poetics of science. That's a kind of poetics of working. You know, that made me think about how you're bringing up these ideas of experimentation.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, like, I really like the idea of like a poetics of science being something that maybe sits with the kind of tension between like method and then experience or affect, which are things that, you know, kind of end up, because of like the desire for objectivity, like being removed, or, you know, kind of forcibly removed from like the way we think about the scientific. But if this kind of poetics is about like kind of reinserting what should be there already, it kind of opens up, like what you're saying, it's like these alternative ways of thinking about what arrives in these experiments.
Yeah.
Which is very exciting.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Congratulations. Yay!